and welcome to A Deadly Silence. I'm your host, Larry Curtis, and it is the intent of all of us affiliated with our program to bring you current and educational information affiliated with the drug and alcohol epidemic sweeping the South Shore community. Today, our guest is Rick Cresta. Rick is a licensed independent clinical social worker with over 20 years' experience with adolescents and young adults. Rick has a master's degree in social work and public health. He is an adjunct clinical professor at Boston University's Graduate School of Social Work and is a trainer and consultant for the Department of Children and Families and the Department of Youth Services, as well as many other agencies. Rick, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
Marijuana.
Yes.
Topic of the evening for tonight. Quite often when we talk about marijuana, the first thing most people say is that marijuana is a gateway drug to all addictions. What do you find happening out there in relationship to that?
It's an interesting question because I think I could say yes and no. Many, if not most, people who smoke marijuana will not go on to harder drugs, cocaine, for example, heroin, etc. But those who do go on often or almost always started with marijuana. So it tends to be a gateway drug for those who go on, but it doesn't mean just because you smoke marijuana, you will go on.
Is there any studies that would say a percentage ratio of out of 100 people that maybe smoked marijuana, how many?
No, I haven't seen that study, but I can say that we know who's at risk. So those young people who have a family history of substance abuse, who have a trauma history, who started using it at an early age, pre-adolescence especially, and those who it stops working for. So if the desire to get high remains, but the drug is no longer working, those young people are at greater risk for going on.
Going on to a more potent, whether alcohol or another type of pill or
exactly.
Opiate.
But I have to say that the way this is used, the gateway drug is often used to the detriment of helping young people see it that way, because what they're often told is that if you smoke weed, marijuana, you're going to go on. And that doesn't connect with them because they honestly believe they won't. Even if they will, they don't believe they will.
Okay.
And the young adults hate to be told that you can see their future.
Okay. Is marijuana use on the rise, or has it been kind of where it's been at for the last 20, 30 years, you know?
Good question. It was consistent for a long time with peaks and valleys from the 80s, but the most recent study in 2011 that surveyed I think it was 47,000, so it was a very large study sample for high school age students, and they found that 27% reported that they used marijuana in the last month. So that's pretty significant because when they ask for the last month, they're not asking for lifetime use, they're asking for the last month to see if it's more regular. And when they compared that to 2008, the number was 19%. So there's a significant jump in just 4 years' time. 3.5 years' time.
What are the
attribute that
to? Attribute that increase to?
Well,
that's a significant increase to 19,
it's 27%. Very significant in a short amount of time. So there could be variations in the study. So we always have to account for variations, but we can look at the 27% as very significant because of the large study size. So it's probably not due to chance. However, what I would say it's due to several things. There's always been this pervasive belief among our society at large, really, that marijuana is, there are little, if any, consequences associated with its use. You often hear that it's natural, but so is arsenic. And we know that that's not harmless, right?
That's not good for us.
Right. So that's not the only measurement you want to have. I think the other thing that contributes more recently is the legalization. Well, I misspoke. Marijuana was not legalized, but the possession of small amounts less than a gram was decriminalized. So there's still a penalty associated with it, but is now a fine rather than jailing. And that can be you could argue the merits of that, and I know that's for a different show. And I think you could argue with that, it wasn't working for us to jail people who were just smoking marijuana and fill the jails, and it wasn't the best use of our resources. However, it sent a message to people who wanted to believe that there were no consequences, that the government says it's okay now. So for people who already wanted to or already believed, this further pushed them in that direction. The other thing, you also hear a lot about medical uses for marijuana. So, again, if it's being prescribed for something, it must be okay. The other thing that's been consistent, I think, as long as I can remember, is the way it's portrayed in the media, especially in the movies. If you look at the movies that have marijuana as one of the themes or a subplot or the main plot, so Cheech and Chong, Up in Smoke, right? Classic. The Friday Night series, Pineapple Express, just a couple years back, The actor James Franco played a pothead, and he got an Academy Award nomination. So it's interesting if you contrast it to other drugs or other drug-themed movies, including alcohol. They're usually not comedies. They usually have some element of tragedy involved. And so there's this different way that it's portrayed pervasively. So there's this belief that it is not harmful. And I will say, and I say this I'm sick of hearing myself say it, but I think it's worth saying to you and your audience, is that I believe, personally, with all the work that I've done with marijuana, is that marijuana causes less harm than all other drugs, including alcohol. However, that does not mean it's harmless.
Right.
And that's where we tend to break apart that harmless compared to, that's what I believe, and you probably believe, but a lot of the users don't see it that way.
As a clinical professional, do you see the lessening of the penalties of being involved in marijuana, as we saw the change here in Massachusetts, a year ago, leading to the ultimate making marijuana like you can smoke and then alcohol?
Well, it's a good example to look at the two, because alcohol is legal for people over 21, but no one is running around saying alcohol is harmless.
Right.
So we kind of missed that piece. So we changed the law, and I think a lot of people were caught off guard by it because it was a referendum in Massachusetts.
Right.
So what happened was we didn't match it with the public health campaign. So to say that, well, even though it's legal for these reasons, these very valid reasons, if you agree with it or not, it doesn't mean that you should run out and do it. And that's the piece that I think we missed.
Okay. What are some of the reasons that you're hearing for people wanting to use marijuana?
Okay. There's some that stand out, that I hear all the time. And I would have to say that because I work primarily with court-involved youth, the percentage of young people who are chronic users, so they use often.
Would a chronic user be considered an addict?
Oh, okay. So chronic users, I should define the term. When I say chronic user, I mean someone who uses daily or close to daily.
Okay.
By the way, when I talked about that study earlier, one detail that I should pair out is that when they asked people who consider themselves chronic users or actually identify that they use daily or near daily, that was 1 in 15. Okay. And that means 6% of young people are using chronically. Now, if we substituted alcohol in and we said that 1 in 15 were drinking daily, we would be really concerned about that. But for some reason, when people substitute marijuana in, they don't see it the same way. They don't see it as the same harm. But that chronic use category, which has definitely grown, is of the most concern, because the consequences that we'll get into a little bit later are most significant for the people who use chronically. They get the brunt of the harm.
Is stress a factor in people wanting to use marijuana?
Yeah, I would say that is the primary reason that people give. So, well, the way I may hear it in terms of a young person's vernacular would be to chill out. It helps me chill. It helps me relax. Okay. And the next one might be helps when I'm angry. So to help modulate or help regulate affect. A big one for teens in particular is when I'm bored. It helps me when I'm bored. Some people will say it helps them be more creative. Some people say it helps them sleep. Some people say, those are the big ones that I hear over and over again. But I would say, this is where marijuana gets tricky. All those are true to some extent, at least in the short term. So the things that they're looking to derive from the use do happen, so that they get the reward. And the consequences are once or twice removed from the use. So it's harder to connect them. So when you look at something like any other drug, including, and when I say drug or substance, I obviously include alcohol in that. But if someone is under the influence, they're drunk, and they crash their car into a tree, the cause and effect is pretty close. So even if I'm in denial about having a problem, it's hard to deny that I just crashed into this tree. If you contrast that to marijuana, the consequences, again, are a step or two removed, and they're less dramatic. So someone who uses marijuana, I'll give an example of this young man who I've worked with, and last year, he was a senior in high school, and he was going to be the first person in his family to graduate. This was a big deal to him. He was highly motivated. This was a goal he's had for a long time, and he was determined to do it. He was also a chronic smoker. So he decided that he would stop smoking until after school. So this was a significant change. He wasn't going to smoke during the day. However, he was still smoking daily. And so it got to the third semester, he got his progress report, and it turned out that he was failing English. Now, as you know, if you're failing English, you can't graduate. So this was incredibly upsetting to him, and he thought he had done all the right things. So I asked him, I said, why are you failing English? And he said, because the teacher told me because I have I've missed too many homework assignments, and because I'm late. English was first period, so he would come in late and would get marked absent for the class. So again, it had nothing to do with marijuana in his mind. But when we traced, when you get high after school, are you likely to do homework? Not usually.
Not usually.
It becomes less appealing. It's already less appealing, but it's more less appealing when you're high. And then what a lot of people don't realize is that there is a hangover effect associated with marijuana. So, yeah, it's very subtle. So for example, if someone gets drunk, they wake up with a hangover, they feel it all over their whole body. If someone gets high and the next morning, I call it heavy head syndrome. It's similar to if you took cold medicine. So you're awake, but your head is just heavy. You just want to leave it on the pillow. So you're more likely to want to stay in bed. I was explaining this to a young man recently, and he said, oh yeah, that's what I call baby neck.
A baby neck.
You know, the baby, exactly, and it was so visual. So,
the visual, great.
So this is very interesting because, again, it makes it harder to break through the denial because as you're well aware, the way people with addiction issues get through the denial is that the weight of consequences outweigh the denial. It becomes not worth it anymore. So with marijuana, they're not dramatic and they're hard to connect and they don't weigh a lot. So it's almost like if you compared, say, a crack addiction is like thunder and lightning. Or heroin is like hail and a blizzard or whatever. And marijuana is like fog. You know, it just rolls in. You don't even notice it's coming. And it's all around you, and it affects all aspects of your life, but very subtly. So in some ways, dealing with marijuana addiction is harder because it doesn't show up. So I mentioned that young man who was going to fail. He couldn't see until I helped him connect the dots that marijuana was directly related to the consequences, the things that were keeping him from graduating, but indirectly related to the graduation. Do you see what I'm saying?
Did he graduate?
Not on time, actually.
Oh,
he did take him. It took him through the summer.
Through the summer,
but he did.
Became the first member of his family.
Yes.
Good. That's great.
Yes.
What are some of the physical or physiological consequences using marijuana?
Okay. The physiological consequences are interesting because they're the ones that get the most press. They're the ones that show up in the research studies, and adults tend to really focus on them. You know, you need to not smoke because look what this does. And they tend to be the less relevant to young people. And this is not just for marijuana, this is across the board. And I think partly it's because understanding adolescence, when you tell someone something's going to happen to you when you're 50, that is too far off to be relevant in this point in their 17.
I'll live to be 50 when I'm 20.
And even if I do, 50 seems very old to them and far away, right? And so that even though they are serious and consequential, they don't seem relevant to them at this point. And adolescents also are able to think they're going to be the exception. So this is other people, it's not going to happen to me. So some of them, though, that are significant are, for young men in particular, testicular cancer, which disproportionately affects young men opposed to older men. If you smoke weekly, just weekly, so not even daily, your rate goes up 2 times of getting the most deadly form of testicular cancer. So that's significant. However, the rate of testicular cancer is very low. So there's a good chance that they will not know anyone that this happens to. So again, the relevance isn't there. Another one is that may be more relevant, but maybe not now, is that it can lead to sexual problems. Now, if you tell a 17-year-old that they're smoking marijuana every day is affecting them sexually, that will mean nothing to them because they have an overabundance of testosterone coursing through their system, so they will not see it. But as they age and their normal rate of testosterone declines, they may have a sharper decline because they've been chipping away at it all along.
Is there a hormonal imbalance issue that happens with the physical side of it as well?
Actually, it is. It has an inverse relationship with testosterone. So this people often ask me, then what about young women? Because obviously testosterone is present in young women too. But as is often the case, women aren't studied as much as men. And in fact, the studies that this information comes from aren't even from the U.S. because the U.S., we're not able to study marijuana by giving it to subjects. We can only ask retrospectively if you smoked and target the rate that way. Okay. Because it's a Schedule I substance still, that we can't use it for studies. So the studies come from Canada, Australia, and England. So similar population, but not directly from the U.S. But they do show significant rates of sexual dysfunction later on in life. But again, it's down the road. And I was explaining this to a young man recently, and he was believing it. He was with me, and he said, "Oh, I'm not worried about that." And I said, "Why?" He said, "I'll just take Viagra." You know, so this idea that,
substitute it with a different drug.
Well, it's the mentality. Yeah. We have something to fix any problem that ails us, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
Somebody once said that one of the physical effects on a male could be that they could actually start developing breasts.
Oh.
Is that a fallacy, or is that one
No,
of those?
No, it actually is true. However, again, the prevalence is so small that, again, you smoke with 20 people on a regular basis, it's not happening to anyone you know, you think it's not true. But there is some truth in it. Again, it's related, I believe, to the testosterone impact. But I have to say, I knew a young man who, at 15, had breast reduction surgery because it was so embarrassing to him because he had developed breast. He didn't think it was related to marijuana until he had smoked for several more years after that and realized that there was a relationship.
What about the impact on the behavior of the cognitive functions?
Okay, so one of the things we often hear about is amotivational syndrome. Even if it's not called that, people often say it makes them lazy, or people who know people who smoke identify that it makes them lazy. So this is something that people will often identify, that there's this decrease in mobility or decrease in wanting to do things. Sometimes young people say, I still do stuff. It doesn't affect me that way. And I say, well, what stuff though? So they tend to do the fun stuff. But the stuff that's challenging, like job searching or homework, tend to fall off. Also, what was I going with that?
What about sports? Does sports also fall off in relationship to
interesting.
behavior?
Some do. A lot of people, especially organized sports, because playing ball you can do when you feel like it, but if organized sports, usually people who smoke, especially chronically, will give up that as an interest because being there, having to be self-disciplined, go when you don't feel like it, that becomes really challenging. So they tend to be less involved in things. And in fact, marijuana tends to become the activity. So rather than doing stuff, marijuana is what we do. And so I ask young people all the time, what do you like to do? What do you do for fun? Chill. And that's really not an activity. In fact, that's the opposite of an activity, right? So people who smoke a lot of weed tend to give up interest or develop less interest. And this is significant because during your adolescence, you're supposed to be developing interest in the world, things that stimulate you, things that you may develop a career on, things that, get you engaged in the world. And so people who smoke tend to have a very narrow view of the world. And they tend to become less interesting, or less interested, and in turn less interesting. Cognitively, this is something I just heard this Wednesday from a young man who said to me, we were talking about his marijuana use and how he has a lot of goals, but he's falling short of meeting them. He said, well, no, marijuana actually helps me. It helps me focus. I do better in school as a result. And I hear this a lot, so I wish that they would study it actually to see if there in fact is some positive impact on people with ADHD, but it would matter on the dosage. So even if it does, it would probably be a small amount. He's smoking pervasively, and that's probably way over what he would need if it was helping him. But what I pointed out to him is that it tends to increase your interest and your focus on a particular material, even if it wasn't interesting before. However, your retention of that material is less. So the illusion of learning without the actual learning.
Going back to that comment about the doses, strength of the marijuana, are we seeing a more potent marijuana today than maybe in the 70s and 80s?
Yes, this is not your grandmother's weed.
And
not to imply your grandmother used.
Maybe she does.
No, that's a good point. It is because of advances in agriculture and treating, and there's a lot of things that are done to it that weren't done in the past. So when I'm talking about the effects of marijuana, I'm referring to clean marijuana, but there are definitely additives in there that weren't in there before, and it is much more potent. And young people are smoking differently than people did in past generations. So in the past, people smoked joints. Now they smoke blunts, so they're really the size of cigars. So they're smoking more quantity and more often and more potent marijuana. So a lot of adults approach it. They might say, well, I did it and I'm fine. But we can't really transfer that to the young people today because they're doing it, what they're doing is different. And further than just the additives from pesticides or helping it grow faster, there's also people consciously add things. So people might dip it in a substance and call it a dippy, and it becomes more potent, the high increases. But sometimes what they dip it in is formaldehyde. It's scary if you know what formaldehyde is, right? But if you don't, it's just another substance. Or dust it with angel dust or cocaine.
Is there a difference between marijuana smoking and marijuana brownies?
Well, yes and no. I would say it's harm reduction if you're eating the brownie because you're not smoking, so you're not getting the harm from the actual smoke. Okay. So the toxins that are in the smoke and the actual damage to the lungs and the heart of the smoke. So yes, if you were someone that wanted to use marijuana and you wanted to reduce your harm, then ingesting it. But what I hear from people, they don't get the same high because it has to go through the digestive system, and some of it breaks down.
Okay. Let's switch gears and go to the psychological and emotional effects of marijuana. Okay,
great. I feel this is the most impactful area, but tends to be left out of all the literature. So I'm not sure why that disconnect exists, but this, when I'm working with young people, this is where I usually end, because I think that this is what really matters. So what we do know, marijuana is a depressant. That usually surprises people because they say, well, not for me, I feel good when I smoke. And I say, well, yeah, it's not a depressant when you're high. That's the short-term effect. But the effect when you're down, when you come down from the high, it's a depressant. So if we had a graph and I showed you this curve, so it goes up and then the high is getting progressively lower, but so is the low, the baseline where you are when you're not high. Almost every person I've ever showed this to that smokes weed will agree with the top part. Yes, I get less high than I used to. What they don't often notice is that they're getting lower.
Being more and more depressed?
Well, it depends. It depends where your baseline is. Yeah. So what happens is eventually you dip below your baseline. And this is chronic use, because if you don't smoke chronically, by the way, your body is amazingly resilient and can rebound and repair the damage that you're doing if you give it enough time. But if you smoke every day, you're assaulting it consistently and you're not giving it a chance to rebound. So what happens is if you are just functioning above depression, for example, over time you're going to be below depression. And I said this to a young man who this was very relevant because he was depressed. And he said, yes, but I figured it out. I smoke before I go to bed, and then I smoke first thing in the morning. So he was trying to outrun the depression, which is very sad when you think about it. Another thing, and I hinted at this earlier, is that if you use marijuana for any of the things that we talked about, and it is effective, you don't learn how to do those things otherwise. So for example, if I use marijuana to alleviate boredom, I didn't find other ways. If I use marijuana because I'm angry or upset and I calm down, I didn't find other ways to self-soothe. Now, it might sound like no big deal because it's working. However, one of the ways, the primary way you become an emotionally mature adult is that you can cope with your emotions. And so they're not learning that. So they end up being emotionally immature, and they then in turn are dependent on the marijuana to help them cope. That is significant. The biggest thing, I think, though, and this is perhaps the best, in the mind of a person who smokes, it's one of the best things it does, is that it helps separate their cognitive and emotional selves. So if I'm really upset, something happened in my family or in a romantic relationship, and I smoke weed, I'm still cognitively aware of what happened, but I'm not feeling the effects emotionally. I took the sting off, I buffered it or blunted the affect, right? This is very different from other drugs. So if I got high on heroin, I'm oblivious to it. So marijuana allows you to still be cognitively aware and even think about it even more in depth, but you're buffering the emotions, and this seems like a real benefit. However, over time, what we hope to do as an adult is integrate our emotion and cognitive self. They're creating a disconnect, which, again, might not seem like a big deal, but our emotions are how we connect with others. So if I'm disconnected from my emotions, say the fingers are the emotion, and these are two people, this person is disconnected from their emotion. This is how we connect with emotions. That's what binds us in an intimate way. If I'm disconnected, this is what happens. This person might not even know what they're missing, but this person feels like I can't get through to you. I feel like you're not here, even though you're here.
Is there a feeling of not caring, or just that I can't get through to you?
Sometimes both. It can be both, and I've heard both. But it sometimes does lead to less caring or more apathy, caring less about stuff than they used to.
In keeping with the physical aspects of it, what's the reactionary period? I mean, you take a driver who's drunk versus a driver that might have smoked marijuana.
That's an interesting one. Dateline, or one of those night shows, did a series on this, or a segment on it. The experience of most people when they get high, and this is another, I don't want to say benefit, but why marijuana is seen as less harmful, is it causes less social...
Less harmful than the alcohol.
Yes, or other drugs, because it causes less social consequences. So the harm of the marijuana is mostly restricted to the user, whereas with alcohol, it affects the people around you and society at large. So someone who smokes weed typically doesn't get in fights. They're not very active, so they're not acting out a lot, although this is not the truth for a small percentage. It has the opposite effect. But for most people, it chills them out, so they're not out there doing stuff. In fact, they're doing less than they would have. If they drive, they tend to drive much slower because your perception has changed, so they think they're going faster than they are, which causes certainly less problems. It can cause problems for people behind you, like an elderly driver, but it doesn't, they tend to get in less accidents.
If you had some recommendations to parents who might be dealing with young children who are smoking marijuana, what would those recommendations be, or signs to be aware of?
Signs to be aware of, there's the typical bloodshot eyes, but kids are pretty slick. They can use Visine to get around that one.
Get the red out.
But you know what? It's funny. I always can tell when my clients are high, and they always remark that I can, and the parents would be the same way. You know what your child's face looks like, and it's very subtle change when someone's been high. Even if it was hours before, there's a relaxation of the facial muscles. There's kind of a glossy look, even if the red's not there. Not wanting to talk as much, kind of isolating from the family, that can be it. But it's really important to speak to young people, not talk at them and lecture them about all the dangers. So what we typically do is we bombard them with, don't do it because of this and this, rather than saying, why do you want to do it? And get at the benefits that they're seeking and try to get those benefits met in another way. And don't overstate the negatives. The negatives, as we've talked about, are significant enough. And what happens when you overstate them, you lose your credibility. And the young person thinks, this person is lying to me, or they don't know what they're talking about, and they tune you out.
Do you find users of young children, young adults or users of marijuana whose parents may have smoked, themselves, and or even smoking today?
Yes, yes.
Well, my mom and dad do, so why can't I?
Yes, yes. There's a high correlation. If your parents smoke, there's a really good chance you'll smoke. Same way with cigarettes. Young people do what they see, not what they're told. So you can talk to you blue in the face, telling them not to do it. If you do it, and I have this situation with a young man that I work with, and his mother smokes, and she says she just does it to help her sleep, and I'm an adult, she says, but it's just, to him, it's just hypocrisy. And really, in her mind, she does care about him, and she's not able to stop on her own, but he hears it as hypocrisy. So if you smoke as a parent, you're really increasing the likelihood tenfold that your kids will smoke. But either way, if that's the case, you still need to talk to them and tell them why you think it's better to wait, because the consequences are greater for people who have developing brains. So the earlier you start, the more likely it's going to do long-term harm. If you wait till you're an adult, you're formed. Of course, there are some consequences, but they're less severe because your brain is already developed.
And there is, in your studies, or the studies that have been conducted, there has been a direct correlation to a slower development of the brain when people who smoke?
Well, slower in the sense of, yes, there's negative impact on cognitive functioning. But again, it's so slow and subtle that the user doesn't often recognize it. But if you measure someone 6 months, and then 6 months of chronic smoking, and 6 months later you measure them, you would see a decline, absolutely.
What resources are available to parents to help try to combat the use of marijuana within their loved ones?
One that I think is great, because it's really a clearinghouse for research, for legislation, for articles, is drugfree.org. It's put together for the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, and that I think it's a great website. You can go through and see for past articles, do their archives, but also you can sign up to have daily emails sent of all the latest information. And I found that to be the best single resource available. Also, for someone who is identified as having a marijuana addiction, where they're smoking chronically and they have a desire to stop and they're having difficulty doing that, because it typically is much harder than they think it will be, and Marijuana Anonymous is a good resource, MA. There are some in the area. They're not nearly as numerous as AA or NA. But I would really encourage them to go there rather than NA or NA, because if they go to them, they typically hear stories that are very different than what they see as their experience.
Okay. We've got about 30 seconds left here. From the standpoint of the parents out there, of the loved ones who may be smoking, one quick minute of advice as to what they should be looking for.
Okay, what I would say to parents is, don't freak out. Talk to them. Understand that many people go through this and don't continue on. Talk about your concerns. Don't, and this is true of all things with young people, talk to them and listen to them rather than lecture them. And that typically is much more effective.
I think that we're coming to an end here, Rick. I want to thank you very much for coming on our show and
You're very
helping
welcome.
us and our viewing audience out there to get a better understanding of, marijuana use, the causes and effects out there. And we hope you enjoyed our segment this evening. And from all of us here at Deadly Silence, we'll see you again next episode. Thank you and good night.